My name is Ted Bleed. I was Christian Theodore Magnus Bleed, and I was born in Minneapolis, Minnesota, April the 29th, 1926. I've been encouraged to put some of my thoughts and remembrances of my life down, of which I'm attempting to do. I want to digress for a bit and tell you a little about my ancestors. My dad was one of 10 children. They came from Sweden in 1888. My dad was 3 weeks old when they left, and the powers to be there told my grandparents that you'll bury him at sea because he'll never make the trip. But my dad did. Came to America. They settled with his family down on the flats alongside the Mississippi River in Minneapolis, where my grandfather got a job in the flour mills. At that time there was Charlie and Frank, Clara and Anna, and then my dad was number 5. The next few years at the flats, Esther and Jenny and Selma and Axel were born. And then in the late, I think it was 1899, my grandfather was having trouble with his asthma. The doctor suggested to him that he go up 65 miles north up around Princeton, where the land was cheap, and get himself an 80-acre farm, which he said that you'll be outside where you'll feel much better, and you'll support your family well on 80 acres. And that's what my grandfather did. So in 1900, the rest of the family went up by train. My dad and his father, they had a horse and wagon and a dog and a cow and a dozen chickens. They started out to make the trip with the horse and wagon. They slept along the way a night or two, I'm not sure. They probably took 2 nights. Must have had some feed along for the horse. But they got up to the farm that they had purchased, and Grandpa had been there some time before with some help, and they had put up a home. It wasn't finished, but it was shelter. Till they got it finished, they stayed with some neighbors named Strumbecks, who had lived close to them on the flats. The land there was cheap. It seems to me that $8 or $10 an acre. And what had happened, the lumber mills had gone through and taken the white pine, and that's what they really wanted, and left the rest, the oak and the elm and the other trees, and took the lumber to the lumber mills and then sold the land to these immigrant farmers. And I never knew till just recent years why they didn't take the rest of the logs. And then I found out that the only thing that floats real well in the river is pine. They didn't have 18-wheeler trucks, so they had to depend on the rivers and the branches of the rivers to get the logs downstream to the mills. Oak and elm will float, but almost submerged. And they had to have enough of the log above water so they could walk across them and be able to dislodge log jams and so forth. But you know, on that new ground, there hadn't been anything ever raised there. It was, they would clear an acre and then plant potatoes. And potatoes grew in abundance, and there was a good price for potatoes. There were potato warehouses within 3 or 4 miles, maybe 5, and they had a good source to sell them. And so what they would do is they had a cow for their milk, chickens for the eggs, they would have a garden and they would butcher animals for their meat. And then the potatoes were the cash crop, and from that they would be able to improve the house, build a barn, and other buildings and so forth. Not knowing anything about commercial fertilizing, they raised potatoes year after year, and before long, I don't know, probably a dozen years or so, maybe a few more, they couldn't raise any more potatoes. The ground just wouldn't do it. They were hollow inside. And to this day, I don't think they've been able to raise good potatoes. But it helped them get a start. And my dad stayed home there and worked, cleared. And he was 12 when they moved up. And he stayed home until he was 27 years old. That meant he was there till 1915. Now, I don't know why he stayed so long. He had a younger brother, 7 years younger, named Axel. Apparently, there must have been some difference of opinion. Anyway, I think my dad finally realized that Axel was going to stay home and he better leave, and so in 1915 he left and went to Minneapolis. And he got a job on the streetcar, which was a fun job. He made a lot of good friends, and they enjoyed the Minneapolis-St. Paul area had a tremendous streetcar system. No matter where you were hardly ever more than 2 blocks from a car line. But running around the cities in those streetcars, you'd have a conductor and a motorman. The motorman drove the streetcar, the conductor collected the fares. But the pay wasn't too good, so my dad kept looking, and after a year or so, he got a job at Ford Motor Company. And he was there when Henry Ford started paying the unbelievable wage of $5 a day. This had been unheard of. And quite surprising that Henry Ford would do that. But he did. And he worked and saved his money. And then he met this girl, Esther Amelia Lundberg. And I'll tell you a little about my grandparents on my mother's side. They came from Sweden a little earlier than 1888, I think about 1882 or 3. They settled down in Prophetstown, Illinois for a short period of time, and they also went to Minnesota. But they settled on a farm out around Cokato, Minnesota. It was called Albion Township. The land there was better than up where my dad settled, but being they were there earlier, they got the better choice of land. And my grandparents on my mother's side, Andrew and Stina Lundberg, they had John and Charlie and Theodore and Jenny. That was their 4 oldest kids. The 3 youngest was Bert, and then my mother, and then a guy named Emil. Well, they farmed there. They were right across the street from the church, or across the road, maybe a block and a half distance. My mother told me about her dad being the location where they lived was custodian of the cemetery. And so when anybody passed away, he had to show them where the grave would be dug and so on and so forth. And she said it was a fairly common sight to see a entourage of buggies coming, and then a lumber wagon on which was a pine box. And somebody had lost a family member. And so when they'd read the sign at the church, check with Mr. Lundberg across the road as to where you're to dig your grave, they would come over, get her dad, my grandfather, and then ask if there was anybody there that might be able to sing a song. And of course my mother and her sister Jenny played guitar. They sang duets, and so my grandpa would take them along, and they would go up to the church. And if they owned a lot, he would show them where it was, and if they didn't have one, he would negotiate where they could be. The diggers would dig the grave as they waited. And then they would have a little service. My grandfather would read the scriptures, have a little prayer, and then my mother and her sister Jenny would sing a song. And so this got to be fairly common for her as a remembrance. But when she got to be a young lady, there wasn't high school where she went. She went to Minneapolis to do housework. That was what seemed to appeal, or the only thing that they were really qualified, the farm girls, was to do housework, and they had learned to work. They had learned to cook, and they had learned to bake. So the more wealthy families in Minneapolis always kept their eye out or knew somebody who was looking for a domestic person. And so my mother got a job there. Kind of odd also that in the summer, many of those people went to the lake, the wealthy people in Minneapolis, Lake Minnetonka and so forth, because it was a common thing that the girls from the farm wanted to go home and help their parents on the farm during the summer. So they would leave probably in June and come back after the harvest. I would think my mother, with as many brothers as she had, certainly could have got along without her, but that's the way they did it. Well, being in Minneapolis, she got acquainted with Esther and Jenny Bleed. That was my dad's sisters. And of course, as time went by, she got introduced to my father. And a romance developed, and so they were married in 1917. Now, a year prior to that, in 1916, there was two very sad things that happened. Her brother Charlie had gone to visit somebody walking through the woods, and found out a day or so later that he hadn't arrived, and so they retraced the steps that he would have taken, and found that he, in crossing a fence, had gotten shot. He had a loaded rifle with him, and somehow or another the gun had gone off and had shot himself, which was a sad thing. My mother came home, she said, from Minneapolis, of course, for the week or so surrounding the funeral. And then it was only a short time later that her only sister Jenny, in giving birth to the latest son they had, of course, had not responded well after the birth was, she had given birth. She had a midwife, but there wasn't any doctor available, and so there wasn't seemingly much to do but just keep her in bed and hope that she'd get well. Well, my mother said she was in a more or less of a coma, semi-coma anyway, for about a week. And then one day, one of the daughters came out to my mother in the kitchen, and she says, "My mother wants you to bring her guitar, tune it." So my mother thought, she isn't able to open her eyes. What in the world could she do with a guitar? But she got the guitar, tuned it up, brought it in, and her sister Jenny was sitting in the bed, up in the bed. she took the guitar and then she sang an old Swedish song. I wished I remember what it was, but I know that the words are something like this in the refrain: angels are waiting, waiting, waiting. And when she finished the song with about 3 verses and the chorus, she handed the guitar back to my mother and lay down, and she was gone. All of her kids stood around the bed and watched her go. My grandma, who was a bit of a dictatorial person, I think. I never knew her, but I think my grandpa was a sort of a milquetoast fella, and Grandma ran the show. But she thought my mother should quit her job and come home and be a housekeeper for her brother-in-law or her late sister's husband and family. But my mother was engaged to marry my dad, and she was kind of her own person, and she wanted to proceed with those plans. So she didn't do that. But in 1917, my mother and dad were married, started housekeeping in Minneapolis. 1918, my brother Wally was born. And then in 1919, my dad got the urge to go farming. And Grandpa and Grandma Lundberg had reached the age when they were thinking they should move to town and sell the farm and make their home in town. Well, it was decided that my mother and dad were prospects for the farm. A price was decided on how much the farm was to sell for. But fortunately, someone said, let's farm together for a year and give us a chance to see how we like it out here. And of course, during the summer of that year is when my brother Paul was born. But something didn't go very good that year. Never quite could understand just what, but my mother said my dad wasn't really my grandmother's favorite. Kind of a typical, probably, mother-in-law. You know, one of the things she disliked about him was he chewed snuff, and I'm sure that's something that we can all agree with is not good. But her own 4 sons all chewed snuff, but she didn't think anything of that. But anyway, when the year was about 11 months expired, they had a year agreement. They farmed somehow on shares. My grandma changed her mind and said that she upped the price on the farm. She wouldn't sell it for what they had said. She thought it was worth more, and that was all it took. My dad got on the train and went back to Minneapolis to see if he could get his job back at Ford Company. And they gladly hired him back. He was a good worker. And so they left the school, or left the farm, and went back to Minneapolis. Interesting enough, my mother had a brother named Bert. Bert was kind of an entrepreneur. He was big in the building game, kind of a high flyer. Nice guy, nice family they were. But apparently he'd borrowed money from his parents to finance some of his venture, and had never paid it back, or hadn't been very diligent in paying it back. And he had a 1915 Studebaker that he had bought, and so he insisted they take this for some of the indebtedness that he owed his parents. Well, they couldn't drive. They had a younger son, Emil, but he had married and left home, and so the Studebaker sat there on the farm. Well, my grandma was insistent that my folks was going to buy that Studebaker. And she wanted $700 for it. Back in those days, you could buy a brand new Model T for $350. And my dad, who was going to work for Ford Motor Company, you didn't dare to drive anything but a Ford. It probably cost you your job. But anyway, they didn't do it, and so they moved back to the city. Well, after they got back to the city that fall, Grandma and Grandpa had a farm auction to sell their personal property and the livestock and so forth, still planning to sell the farm to somebody. At the farm auction, they sold the Studebaker. They got $65 for it. So this was sort of kind of the things that happened. The farm, believe it or not, that was 1920, maybe now 21 when they sold the farm. I mean, when they had the auction. The farm never did sell. Grandma died in 22. Grandpa moved over with his son Emil and stayed there for 10 years, and he passed away in 32. And the farm sat there year after year. They probably rent out the fields one year, probably wouldn't. And finally in 1940, when things started to pick up, they were offered $4,000 for the farm, and they sold it. Which was another foolish thing, because had they waited another 10 years or less, the farm would have been worth some real money. But anyway, we're now back in Minneapolis, and I'm in this family of Magny and Millie Bleed and Wallace and Paul Bleed, and no one could have come into a finer family than I did. We had a little bungalow, 3824 15th Avenue South. 2 small bedrooms, and then the boys had 1 bedroom and my folks had 1. And I guess I must have slept in my folks' bedroom. But anyway, Alice Lundberg, a niece of my mother's, came to Minneapolis to get a job, and did get a job, but for a short period of time, she stayed there. I don't know where she slept. It was kind of interesting. She soon met a guy. She's a very attractive lady. In fact, she's living today up in a home on Wayzata Boulevard in Minneapolis. And was a man named Martin Gustafson, who got his eye on her and started dating her. And this Martin worked for the Sinsmaster Bacon Company. And when he'd come to pick her up and take her out for a ride or whatever, a date, he would bring a loaf of packaged bread. That was kind of new. Real treat, because everybody had to eat homemade bread. And now there was such a thing as buying this real soft stuff that came in a sliced package. I guess he did that, and Wally was the oldest, and Paul. They got looking forward to Martin coming because he always got a loaf of bread. Well, after so many times of doing that, I guess he decided that was enough. Started doing it only once in a while. Well, Alice tells about the time that Martin came and rapped on the door. Wally opened the door. Didn't say hello or anything. He just said, "Oh, no bread tonight either." So that got to be a joke over the years. No bread tonight either. But we had a nice, it was a nice part of Minneapolis. It was just a block from my Aunt Jenny's, where she lived there, and her husband Frank and her daughter Irene. And we were doing pretty good. Well then, in 1929, my dad got the bug to go farming again. He found that the house across the road from where he had grown up was for sale. The family that owned it was named Johnson, and they wanted to move to Los Angeles, and they later did. They were asking an exorbitant price of $8,000, which was unheard of. But it was a nice farm, well laid out, nice buildings. And my dad and mother owned the house, the bungalow, and it was worth, well, what they paid for it was $4,500, and my dad had built a garage since they bought it. And he assumed, which was well to assume, I guess, that he could get his money back. And so with that, they would be able to pay $8,000 for the farm. They'd save their money. And in the meantime, he borrowed what he needed from his brother in Minneapolis, Brother Frank. He bought the farm. And the Johnson family bought 2 new cars and fitted it with each a trailer. They were a pretty good-sized family. I think they were about 7 total. They put their personal belongings on the 2 trailers and left for California. And of course, those days you could sell a car in California for quite a bit more money than around there because of the freight difference. Now, later years, we've equalized the freight, but that wasn't the way it was then. Well, this was in September 1929 that Dad bought the farm. And you probably remember hearing of Black Tuesday, I think it was, in October of 1929 when the stock market crashed. And if you've ever read any accounts of that crash and the aftermath, it was a real tragic thing. And of course there my folks owned a farm and owned a house in town, and the real estate prices just took a nosedive. And so after all winter long, my dad finally sold the bungalow for $2,500. Now, I go by there every time, or nearly every time I'm in Minneapolis, because my cousin still lives a block away. And so I walk around there and kind of think about the old days, what my family probably did. Thinking about the time we had a big terrace in front, and then my dad added to the terrace with snow, and we had about a 14-foot slide down the terrace out across the street. There wasn't much traffic. So if you watched, if there's anything coming, you got a real ride across there, I'm told. But I don't know how. I was 4 when we moved on the farm, 1930, and this had to be before that. I got up there and down I went, and a car was coming. And according to my brother Wally, I went right between the front and back wheels. They were a high Model T and never touched anything. But boy, when my dad found out about that, you never saw anything come down so fast in your life, and that ended the sliding there. But after selling that bungalow for $2,500, he paid his brother that much, but you know, he was short, because he was $2,000 short, and so he had to keep his job for a while longer in Minneapolis, and he would commute down on Monday and then come back on Saturday. And he worked nights at the old Ford plant, and he would come up to the farm on Saturday morning after he got off at 7 o'clock, and he'd work Saturday, and he'd be home Sunday, and he'd work part of Monday, and then he would go back so he could relieve the fella at 11 o'clock at night, and then he'd work nights and sleep at my Aunt Jenny's during the day in the basement, and so on and so forth. Well, that put my mother and Wally and Paul to do the farming during the week. I was too small. And I'll tell you, I marvel to this day at my brothers and my mother. My mother was she had lived on a farm. She knew what made things go, and she was a pretty good superintendent. But you know, Wally was 11 years old. We had a big team of gray horses. And to put the harness on those horses, my brother Wally had to stand on a wooden box to get up high enough to get it on. And they farmed. Paul was another hard worker. And my mother would give directions and so on. And then to top it off, what even made it worse was right across the road from my dad's brother Axel. Axel was the younger brother that took over the parents' farm. And after his folks, my grandparents, had retired. And it was during the Prohibition days, and I don't know what he was brewing up down there in the summer kitchen, but something that didn't agree with him either had too much yeast in it or not enough. But he was either the most friendly person you could meet or the most hateful person. And he put my mother and my brothers through an awful lot of uncomfortableness. He didn't intimidate my mother. He didn't intimidate Wally nor Paul, but he did intimidate his brother. That's my dad. And but they made it. Worked out. My dad bought a Model T Ford for the family to have, to go to town, to have a little recreation in. We'd go on picnics to Lake Julia. We'd fly around in that Model T, and that bugged my uncle. He didn't think that was necessary. And then I think one of the big factors, our farm was much nicer than his. Laid out much better, better buildings and all. And I think jealousy was part of the problem. Well, everything went on for 2 years. Banks were closing. Times were getting harder. Just seems like one thing went from bad to worse. Start having drought. The Dust Bowl days. The dust blowing in from Nebraska and North and South Dakota, the air would just be kind of reddish. And you couldn't raise any crop to mount anything. It was hard for the cattle to even exist. But my dad worked down in Minneapolis, and then something happened down there that was to hurry something up again. He had gotten his brother paid off. And now I think he was working to get just a little nest egg saved for a rainy day. But one night he went down on a Monday night. He was going to relieve his partner there at 11 o'clock. He used to blow his horn, and the guy'd come down, open the gate. The plant was surrounded by a cyclone fence, so they kept fence people out. But my dad blew the horn, and nobody came, so finally he went somewhere where they had a kind of a secret opening to get in. He went in and looked all over for this guy. Finally, he found him sleeping in an elevator on the floor, freight elevator. So Dad went over to shake him, to wake him up, and realized he had been murdered. Further examination and inspection by the police department, they realized that he had been killed up on the 7th floor and pushed down the elevator shaft. Murder was never solved to this day. It was down in a part of Minneapolis where, again, it was during the bootlegging days. Somebody thought he might have had something to do down there. I don't know. But after that, my dad was very uneasy. And so it wasn't long after that that he turned in his time and came home to farm. And Wally and Paul, they'd grown up. They were nice young men. We had a good time, even though the times were hard. Everybody was in the same boat. And you made do with what you had, and it seems like you can have fun too. But my brothers and I still remember with fondness how they pitched in and helped my mother and dad and helped me as a kid brother. Things went along like that until 1936. Wally had had some experiences working for farmers. Everybody liked Wally. Everybody liked Paul. Everybody liked my folks. And I'm not so sure about myself. I guess I was all right. I was known as Teddy. But in addition, I think Wally, Wally liked everybody, and particularly the girls. And everybody liked Wally, particularly the girls. He was a ladies' man. And I enjoyed having a big brother that could get the girls. I thought that was what they call now cool. One of his farm experiences that he tells about is he worked for one couple of brothers for 2 weeks for $10, and on his way home he went by a farmer that dealt a little in old used cars. He had a Model T Ford. I keep mentioning Model T Fords. Up in that country, that was the only car. Very few people. I was a few Chevrolets, but mostly Fords. But he stopped in there, and they had a Model T Ford Coupe. And Wally asked this Harry Sandquist, "What do you take for the car?" And with some debating back and forth, the price was settled on at $8.50. So Wally paid the car. He had $1.50 left over. He drove down to the store and put in 50 cents worth of gas. And when he came home, he had a car paid for. He had gas in his tank, and he had money in his pocket. And he said later he felt like Rockefeller. He kept that car for not only about a couple of months, and then he and my brother Paul went to St. Cloud, and they were continually looking at cars. He arranged a deal to trade this Model T off on a Model A Ford Roadster, and I think he was going to pay $45 difference. But he had to come home and get my dad with some money and also to sign the necessary papers. Well, we went back to St. Cloud. I went with that time. We got this Model A. Wally painted it up, and it was a slick Model A Roadster. But then in August, about the middle of August, a couple of his friends came and said, "Listen, you got the best car. If we sell our cars, I think we can get $20, $25 each for them. We'll pay the gas. Let's go to Rockford, Illinois, and see if we can get work." And that's exactly what they did. They left. My brother was, I don't think he was quite 18. Close. His birthday's August. It was close. Well, they went to Rockford, and we didn't hear anything, I think we did get a card that they'd gotten there. But every time we'd see somebody, you heard from the boys, no, I ain't heard. I wonder if they got work, I don't know, and so on. Well, then on Labor Day weekend, Sunday before Labor Day, my brother Paul and I was sitting reading the Sunday paper, and we heard a horn blowing, and we looked down the road, and here comes the Model A Roadster. And we said, well, they're back. apparently they didn't get work, and they're coming home. We were kind of glad in a way, because we'd been lonesome. But come to find out, they had gotten work, and they were just coming back to get some more clothes. And they came up on Sunday and had to leave again on Monday. And that's what they did. But when they left that time, it left a kind of an empty feeling for me. Because I realized then that Wally was gone now. And probably never to come home again to stay. Well, it so happened that there was a recession in 1938, and he was home for about 8 months. But other than that, when they got called back in the early part of 39, Hitler had invaded Poland. The war scare was getting such that they started with the Lend-Lease programs for England and so on and so forth, and most everybody that was laid off got called back. And they went back to Rockford. About a year or so later, or even later that year, my brother Paul went to Rockford, and he also got work there. And then here's where my brothers were good to me. After Paul had been working a while and going to get a better car, he also drove a Ford Roadster. I'm sure you're wondering if there was anything but Roadsters those days, but that was kind of a convertible of the day. And anyway, he wrote me and said, I was 14. He said, how would you like to have my old Roadster? He said, Wally and I have talked, and if you'd like to have it, we'll see that you get it. We'll tow it home for you. Well, you know, what do you expect a guy to say? Boy, I was all for it. My folks said okay. So in Easter, 1941, spring there, they came up for Easter. They towed the car up. And that was the first time that we had met Doris Brinker, who was to later become Doris Bleed. And Wally was bringing her home to meet my folks. And so that was quite a thing. Just want to digress a little bit. In 1937, something happened. My dad had bought a beautiful sorrel gelding horse. And he'd paid a big price for it for those days, $150. And we'd had it about a year, maybe a little less. It was cutting grain on the grain binder with 3-horse hookup, and the horse started to stumble. Didn't seem like it was quite with it. So we unhooked the horse and took him home, called the veterinary. When the veterinary looked him over and did some checking, he says, you know, I've read about this in other parts of the country, but not around here. He says, I think your horse has got sleeping sickness. And sleeping sickness it was. An epidemic that hit that country, and it killed horses by the thousands. A sort of a brain inflammation. And there was nothing to do for them. When they got it, you almost did like we did. We had to shoot the horse. And as I say, my dad felt so bad. He felt bad losing the horse. But, you know, Wally, he was a guy that was very generous. Maybe he is to this day, but I'm thinking back in those days. He'd helped my dad buy that horse. Paid for some of it. He also helped my brother Paul get a car. And he bought me a new bicycle in 1937. Back in those days, I suppose he was probably making 45 cents an hour. Again, a kind of a thing that I admired about my brother. But after that epidemic, or during the epidemic of the sleeping sickness, the implement companies were really on the ball, and they came out with a John Deere, Alice Chalmers, International Harvester, came out with a small rubber-tired tractor, bigger than the yard tractors you see today, quite a bit bigger. But they would replace a team of horses on a farm, 80-acre farm. They would sell for about $550 for the tractor. Of course, you had to buy some equipment to go with them. But my dad never wanted to do it. He liked horses, and he farmed with horses. And he really didn't care to spend that much money. It bugged me because everybody around had a tractor to run around on the fields with, and we didn't have one. But anyway, he was smarter than I. He got along. He would hire for some of the heavier work, and so on and so forth.